Hello. Thank you, Dana. I am Robin. I am a recovered alcoholic. And if you hear some strange barking or what sounds like screaming, that's my dog. His bark sounds like a scream. So please forgive him. He gets excited sometimes. Okay, I have been sober since October 17th of 2003. I get those numbers transposed sometimes. I also happen to be a recovered Al-Anon and a recovered chronic compulsive eater, and I mention that here only because we are not restricted to particular fellowship groups. I'm not violating any traditions, but I also want people to know that this program can work for a myriad of problems. That's my dog. And that Cliff Bishop has helped people from a number of different fellowships just by teaching people how to work the program out of the Big Book. It's amazing how far the Fellowship of AA has strayed from that, and how many other fellowships who tried to practice the principles out of the Big Book were not able to because they didn't really understand how to. And so from his tutelage, so many people around the world have learned how to. And fellowships, all kinds of different fellowships, have learned how to use the program out of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous to apply it to their problems as well. And a remarkable thing has begun to happen all over the world, and it's wonderful. And so anyway, I've been able to recover from all of those problems using the same program, and it's wonderful. Anyway, by far, the worst of my problems has been my alcoholism. And when I first tried AA back in 2000, I had never heard of Cliff Bishop, and but he had been out in the trenches working the program out of the Big Book of AA since the 80s. And the group of Primary Purpose he had started back then and everything else, and I'd never heard of it. And when I went to the detox facility of, I can't remember the name of the hospital at the time, it's changed names so many times, I happened to miss our group coming in, that particular group coming to carry the message there. They didn't show up there the day that I was in there, so I didn't hear them carrying the message. So when I tried to get sober in AA at that time, it was based on doing what I was taught when I went to intensive outpatient from that hospital, which was going to 90 meetings in 90 days. And, so I'd go to the meeting every day and listen to what they would tell me in those meetings, which is basically I would hear the war stories of what people did when they were drinking, so I would be thoroughly convinced that they were alcoholics and they had drinking problems based on the crazy things that they did when they were drinking, and that they somehow had figured out a way to not do that anymore, and yay for them. And I was sitting on the edge of my seat trying to figure out how they had managed to do that, and I was miserable. And the longest I was able to make it without drinking during that time was about a week and a half. And then, from when they let me out of detox, when I'd go home, and that was the first time they let me out of detox. I made it a week and a half. And then I was drinking again. I remember driving home one night and after an AA meeting, and there was a bar. I just pulled over without any thought at all about the consequences. My husband had given me an ultimatum. He said, never, if you ever drink again, I'm going to have to leave. And I wanted to quit anyway, so it wasn't so much the ultimatum that made me quit drinking as it was I wanted to quit anyway. And that gave me the impetus to actually take some action to quit. So, I had gone to I'd gone to the trouble to take the time off work. I had gone into the detox. I'd, gotten all dried out. I started going to this, this outpatient treatment thing. So I went to work all day. I'd go to the 3-hour outpatient thing, then I'd go to an AA meeting at night. And I figured that's how we stayed sober, as we kept so busy, literally, that we didn't have time to drink. And that over time, we would get so used to this new way of life that that's how we would stay sober. That gradually the desire to drink would be replaced by this new habit or this new way of life. I really thought that's how it worked, because the obsession never left. I was still wanting to do that. I didn't work any steps. I was just going to these meetings every night after this class. And so I'm driving down the street one night after my AA meeting, and I have my trigger list in my pocket of things to avoid. But I lived on Greenville Avenue, which for those of you who don't live in Dallas, Texas, you may not know what that means. But those who do live in Dallas, Texas, knows that that's where all the bars are. So I lived right off Greenville Avenue. So I couldn't very well drive a different route to get home, right? I thought that was going to doom me to drink right there, but as I've learned from Cliff, that's not got anything to do with why I drank. But anyway, I'm driving down Greenville Avenue, and there's a bar, and so I pull right into the bar, and there was no thought at all of what the terrific consequences might be, as the big book said. I just pulled right in, went inside, and started drinking. And I drank to blackout, and I came to in the parking lot in the middle of the night, and there it was, I couldn't, the next day I was drinking again, and I couldn't figure out how to go back to the state of not drinking. And so I had to go back into the detox facility to get separated from alcohol again. That was the only way to put it. I didn't really need to detox. I just needed to, push the reset button or something, so I could get separated again. But of course, as soon as I got out, I started drinking again. This went on for months, all summer long. I think for about 5 months, I tried to get sober and stay that way, and I couldn't. That was my experience of AA. I even got a sponsor and tried to work the steps. And my experience of that was, my step one was she had me make a list of all the terrible things, all the consequences of my drinking. And I made that list and sat down with her, and she had me read it to her, and then she said, "Now do you see why your life is powerless?" And I said, "No." And she goes, "Well, looking at that list, don't you see why your life is powerless?" And I said, "No." So that's a list of terrible things that have happened as a result of my drinking. But the rest of my life is not I'm not powerless over the rest of my life. That's just, bad stuff that's happened because I was drinking. If I weren't drinking, everything would be fine. I need to quit drinking. I mean, it's like we were going round and round. I couldn't see it her way, and she couldn't see it mine. I was like, I just need to quit drinking here. My life's not powerless. Excuse me. My life's not unmanageable. I'm sorry. My life's not unmanageable. I'm managing my life just fine. I just need to quit drinking. And she's like, "But don't you see that the alcohol makes your life unmanageable? The inability to stop drinking makes your life unmanageable." And I said, "No, I don't see that." And anyway, we were at an impasse, and I couldn't get past step one. Finally, because I wanted to get through the steps, and I really believed that if I got through the steps, I'd be able to quit drinking, I lied, and I said, "Yes, I do see that. My life is unmanageable because I'm powerless over alcohol." I didn't know what that meant, but I said, "Okay, I see that." And she said, "Okay, now, do you believe that a power greater than yourself can restore you to sanity?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Why not?" And I said, well, I'm not even sure that I believe that there's a power greater than myself. But even if there is, I've asked many times for him to help me stop drinking, and it hasn't happened yet. So I don't believe that that's going to happen. So once again, we were at an impasse. You know, we weren't getting anywhere here with the steps. And I just, you know, I couldn't get past all this. And I say all this because Cliff had such a simple way of explaining all of these things to me. When I first came back into AA, the next time around in 2003 when I got sober the last time, he wasn't my sponsor at that time. But the person who became my sponsor had taught her well. You know, there was an entire group of people who went around Dallas carrying the message. And they sponsored people, and they sponsored people, and they all carried the message to people like me who wound up places looking for help and were desperate. And they were all carrying a consistent message which explained what the problem was and explained what the solution was. And it was so simple. It was incredibly simple. And it helped me to understand exactly why my life was unmanageable. That made so much more sense. And it's so ironic because the exact thing that I was arguing with my my sponsor in 2000 about was actually correct. It was like, well, yeah, the fact that I couldn't quit drinking, that's what the problem was, not the rest of my life. That was what the problem was. And the consequences had nothing to do with it. And so I'll explain that a little bit more here in a second, but I want to point out that it was all because Cliff didn't discover that on his own or anything. He's not like the mastermind of all that information. What Cliff did was he took the heat. He came to Dallas and he said, you know what, this information is so important. The people are dying because they don't have it. It is so simple, and it has been lost. Here it is. AA is all over the world, and it's right here, and this information is right here in this little book, and nobody reads this little book anymore. Nobody talks about what's in this little book anymore, and these people are coming to AA in droves, and they're dying. And there's no reason for that. It doesn't have to be that way. And so many people are coming to AA that don't need to be there, and they're not dying. And there's more of them than there are of us who are dying in AA. So maybe that's what the problem is. And I can't do anything about that, but what I can do is I can teach what's in this book. And so he went out fearlessly and very stubbornly, and he did that. He didn't stop. He used to get hate mail. I mean, and he had stacks, and he would keep it all. It's funny. And he got stacks of hate mail from people around the area that really were angry at what he was doing. But he started up the group, primary purpose, and the sole purpose of the group was the primary purpose of AA, which is to carry the message that's in the book to the alcoholic who still suffered. And so all that the group would do was study the book, and they only met a few nights a week, and then the rest of the time they would carry the message to various what he called wind-up joints throughout the city of Dallas. And then it began to spread to outlying areas, of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So it would be suburbs, and it'd be small towns, and it'd be little, rural places, and throughout the Metroplex, and into Fort Worth and stuff like that, and to hospitals and jails and treatment centers and transitional living facilities, and just wherever people wound up. Alcoholics wound up. That's what he meant by a wind-up joint. People like me would end up going for help, or it wound up going against their will, like Dale's and stuff. And he and his, people that he sponsored, or other members of the group, as the group grew, there would be other members of the group, and they would all do the same thing, and they would carry the message there. And the message they would carry was consistently just the message in the book. Here's what the problem is. Here's what the solution is. And this is what we did, and it worked for us. And if you're interested, we'll show you what we did. And that's all that they did. And that's how the group grew. And the only people that were really interested, of course, were the ones that had tried AA and it didn't work for them, or had tried everything else and it didn't work for them. Those were the only ones that were interested in doing it that way, because it is a drastic way to do things. It is an extreme way of doing things, and everybody else scoffed at him or weren't interested and thought, wow, that's really extreme. And he didn't care. He really didn't care. He's like, that's fine, And so he might be at somewhere like the Salvation Army, where there's a lot of people in that room who are required to sit in the meeting listening to Cliff and his guys carry that message there. And nobody's interested in what he's got to say except for maybe two guys. He didn't care. He's there for those two guys that are interested. Everybody else, they just got to sit there, and that's fine. The cool thing about that is he's planting a seed, because maybe many of those guys aren't interested now, but 5 years, 10 years on down the road, they might be interested, because maybe they'll be ready later, or maybe those guys will have family members or loved ones or friends who might fit into that criteria, who might need what Cliff is teaching about, that kind of thing. Anyway, so he would just keep persevering, even though most of the people that he was talking to, most of the people that they were carrying the message to, weren't interested in a thing he had to say. They wanted to be able to share what was going on with them. They wanted to be able to talk about their stuff. So, but that's okay. He did it anyway. He persevered, and it worked. And because he did that, and I think he started out doing this in like the early 80s, maybe. And I could be wrong about the time frame, but he started doing that, and he took the heat, and it was just him and a few guys, and they kept doing that. And because of that, lo and behold, when I came along in 2003, by that time there were women that had been helped, and so they were carrying the message too, and there was a strong core of women sponsors by that point. So there was someone that was able to sponsor me and carry this message to me and help me learn how to do that. And you got to be strong when you go into these facilities, because it's still that way today. When you go into these places, most people don't want to hear what you have to say, because they're not ready to recover. They're not ready to do the work. They've ended up in these places a lot of times because the law has put them there, or there's nowhere else to go. Someone else has told them, you need help, go there, so they go, and they think they're ready, but then when they learn what's involved, they find out, I don't want to do that. That kind of thing. So when they hear what you have to say, they realize, I don't want to do any of that, so they're not interested. And they've been brought up in this very this other world where things are much easier, middle of the road kind of a world where they don't have to do anything. Work, the work is very easy. They get to go and be coddled. Their ego gets to be, stroked, and they get to be told, you poor thing, life's been very hard for you. Let's listen to all your woes and your worries, and we'll give you some advice that will help you feel better about the situation. That's what they're used to, because that's, much of what treatment is like today, much of what counseling is like, much of what AA meetings are like. And so when people that have been taught by Cliff and Cliff's, people, when I say that, when they've been taught what the big book has taught them to do, I shouldn't say Cliff's people, when they've been taught what the big book has told us to do, and they go into these places and they teach out of the big book, and so these people hear that, they're like, well, that's a lot of hard work, and I'm not ready for that, So it's not easy to go into these places and do these things that Cliff taught us. This is what the big book tells us you're going to need to do if you are a chronic alcoholic and you want to survive this thing. And if you really realize your truth and you really know that that's what you are, then you're gonna feel motivated to do it. And that's the way it was for me. When I came across this, I was so done with drinking. I was so scared. I knew I was going to drink again if I didn't find help. And when I was in treatment this last time, I went to, it was a whole different ballgame in 2003 than it was in 2000. Because in 2000, I had a job and my insurance paid for me to go to treatment and a fancy doctor and everything else. In 2003, I had no job, I had no husband, I had no, none of that. And I was declared indigent by the state so that I could go into a state-sponsored, a state-run facility and all of that kind of thing. And talk about humbling and humiliating and everything else. And so it was, treatment wasn't really treatment like you think of treatment. It was basically they just stuck you in there with everybody else, but it wasn't, sobriety by the sea where you get, to meditate by the ocean and all that kind of stuff. But there were a lot of classes and a lot of stuff on 90 meetings in 90 days and trigger lists and, this is what your sobriety plan is going to be like, or what is the relapse prevention plan is going to be all about when you get out, and this is how you're going to stay sober when you get out. And AA is going to be a big part of it, but this is how you're going to go about doing AA. And that I was going to have a lot of control and power over my own sobriety, basically. It's kind of what you're taught, and I don't think that they mean any harm by that. I think, though, that treatment is more focused on people that aren't yet powerless or maybe aren't real alcoholics. I don't know, and maybe I'm being controversial in saying that, and I probably shouldn't be saying this here in this story. That's been my experience, and I need to back off of that. Okay, well, in my experience, I was taught a lot of things that I don't actually have the power to do. Let me just put it that way. And so when I thought, the first time I thought I had a lot of power. The second time when I came in, I knew I had no power to do any of these things they were suggesting I do. I knew that. And so when I met a girl in my treatment facility who had been to the group I go to now and had worked the steps out of the book, and Cliff had been her grand sponsor, I believe. Yeah, her grand sponsor. And she had relapsed, obviously, or she wouldn't have been there. She told me, she said, look, you seem really sincere. I asked her, I was talking about getting a sponsor, and she said, you seem really sincere. I'm going to give you the phone number of somebody who you might want to call if you're looking for a sponsor. She gave me the phone number from somebody in Cliff's group, and she also gave me some phone numbers from some other groups. She said, all of these ladies will be able to help you. This one, though, works directly out of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. She'll be very strict. You'll be getting it the old school way. And I don't recommend you calling her, though, unless that's what you want. And I said, okay, well, why would I want to do it any other way? And she said, well, some people don't want to do it that way. And I said, well, okay, why wouldn't they want to? And she said, well, it's stricter. I said, but it's generally more successful. I said, well, I want the more successful one. So I called the girl, and, and that's how it's been ever since, That was a girl that was, Cliff was her grand sponsor at that time. And ever since then, I had a couple different sponsors before Cliff became my sponsor, but every single one of them, Cliff was either their sponsor or their grand sponsor. And I learned a lot from each one of them. All of them went from the big book. It was remarkable, and it was the most awesome experience. But one of the things I learned, one of the fundamental differences about step one, for example, was not that it was about what made me an alcoholic. I had a much more in-depth understanding of what made me an alcoholic. And it was basically not that my consequences are what made me an alcoholic. It was that once I started drinking, because I had some sort of bodily and mental difference in me than most people, I couldn't handle the alcohol in the same way, and so I had a different reaction to it. And I would crave more once I had that first drink. And so I would crave more alcohol. And the more I drank, the more I would crave. And the craving was more powerful than anything I could control. So it wasn't just simply this mild craving. It was literally, it would hijack my brain and take over kind of a thing. But it was a physical thing. It was a chemical reaction, firing off inside my body and taking over my brain kind of a thing. And so I wouldn't be able to control it any more than somebody with strawberries, an allergy to strawberries or something could control their allergic reaction to that. And so I wouldn't be able to say, okay, well, this time I'm not going to have that allergic reaction. So once I would start drinking, I wouldn't be able to stop. I wouldn't be able to control the amount that I drank. And, of course, that happened to me from day one when I had any significant amount of alcohol the first time. I couldn't stop drinking, and I drank to blackout immediately. And when I say immediately, I mean I blacked out within like 15 minutes. I just couldn't stop drinking. And every time I drank after that, the same thing happened. And so it took me a couple of years to figure out how to drink so I didn't black out, so I could drink without blacking out, basically. And it was a lot of experimentation and a lot of figuring out what was going on and all of that kind of thing, so I could drink a little bit more like normal people and enjoy it and drink for several hours and not black out and that kind of thing. And that's one component of alcoholism, the book tells us. I never knew that. I was in the book the whole time, and I never knew that. The doctor's opinion tells us that doesn't happen to anybody else. I guess that's what defines an alcoholic. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that's, really and truly a medical fact. I don't know. But it says in the book that it doesn't happen to the average temperate drinker, and that sets us apart as a distinct and separate entity. As someone that has this allergic reaction that manifests in the form of a craving like that. Because there are people who have allergic reactions to alcohol that manifest in other ways, such as like hives or red face and stuff like that, and that's different. That's not the same thing. But anyway, so that's one aspect of it. So once I start, I can't stop drinking, and that's what makes me powerless. That's one aspect of being powerless over alcohol. And that made things so simple. And once that was explained to me, it made sense. And then the other aspect, the unmanageability part, the part where my life had become unmanageable, was explained to me is, well, had I ever made the decision to never drink again, I made the decision because I wanted to stop drinking again, not because someone else wanted me to. And there had been several times in my life where I wanted to stop because I wanted to stop, not just because my husband wanted me to. And like one time I had completely totaled a car and everything else, and my insurance, and I was afraid my insurance was going to not cover the total car and stuff. And there's more to it than that, but basically it scared me really badly, and I wanted to stop because I thought, oh my God, only people who are alcoholics do this kind of thing, and I'm not an alcoholic, so so I'm never going to drink again, and I meant it, and I stopped drinking cold turkey for a month on my own, just never drank again, didn't go to AA or anything. I just, because of course if you go to AA, that means you're an alcoholic, and this was way before. So I stopped drinking on my own, and I made it about 30 days, and my husband invited me to go out and hang out with him and his friends and one night, and I told myself, oh, I can do it, that I can just hang out with them and drink non-alcoholic wine and have a good time. And I went there, and they were hanging out at a bar, and they didn't sell non-alcoholic wine at the bar. They sold non-alcoholic beer, but not wine, and I didn't like beer. So at first I tried ordering just a Diet Coke, and then I thought, well, no, just one glass of wine won't hurt. I ordered one glass of wine, and not knowing about the allergy, of course. And, drank to blackout. And the next, and I remember even thinking, after I had the first glass of wine, my intention had been to not drink anymore. But then I kept ordering, and somewhere in there I thought, well, okay, tomorrow I'll just go back to not drinking again. And the book talks about that kind of thinking. Well, what's the use anyway? Might as well get good and drunk now, kind of thing. And so the next day, so I couldn't go back to not drinking. And so there I was drinking again, full on drinking again. And so, yeah, the whole idea of if you ever decided you never wanted to drink again and you drank again, perhaps perhaps you're an alcoholic. That's your life is unmanageable if you can't manage the decision to never drink again. And that was me. I couldn't manage that decision to not ever drink again. I had wanted to never drink again more than anything, and I was able to stick to it. I was able to make that choice, stick to it every day for 30 days. And I would, I'm not going to drink today, and I'd go home every night and not drink, And it was tough. And then all of a sudden, the consequences of what had happened 30 days before were no longer enough to keep me from drinking. And Anyway, that, it was explained to me, is what made my life unmanageable. And that was about the obsession. And once the obsession, the book tells us, once the obsession is fully formed in a person, then there's very little chance of his recovery without a spiritual experience or awakening. And so, that's what made me an alcoholic of the chronic variety, and I was going to need a spiritual solution, and that sounded like me. And so my solution was in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and it made it all very simple, and it was awesome to have that solution presented to me in that way. And it's like, if you haven't yet reached the stage in your alcoholism where you can't manage that decision, perhaps you don't need this solution. Perhaps you can just make the decision not to drink anymore. And if you're not sure if you've reached that stage, the book says, why don't you go try? And, all these very common sense, simple things. And when I had tried before, it had always been so complicated in my mind, and all these things that, and this is just simply what Cliff did was brought me back to these truths. And when he was my sponsor, I remember, I'd gotten all complicated in my head. I was apparently kind of difficult to sponsor. Several sponsors told me that, which is why I had several, and I don't mean several all at once. I mean several sponsors in a row. When I got to Cliff, finally, and he took me through my 5th step, he was so incredible. He's so simple. He could convey an entirely, something that seemed very complicated and convoluted and, a whole concept that would take me paragraphs to explain. He could say it in like one sentence in about 5 words. That's how he was. He was a man of very few words and short sentences, and he could have an entire conversation in about, 3 minutes. And something that would have taken me 30 minutes to get across to someone I sponsor, he could get across 3 minutes, to me. And I've always admired that about him. But anyway, so during this 5th step that he had with me, I'm all worried about all this stuff. I have all these fears, and this is what's keeping me from being able to, really progress. And I wasn't trusting, my previous sponsor and wasn't believing her and couldn't let this stuff go. And so I get to Cliff, and, I've got this stuff written down. And he said, so-and-so said all this about me, and I can't get over it, and I fear that it might be true, and blah, 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 blah. And he's like, oh, don't pay any attention to her. And bam, the fear was gone. And it never came back. And I just, I'm laughing because before that I had put all this analysis into why do I have this fear and, all this stuff. And he's like, oh, just don't pay any attention to her. This is how he was. He was so simple about, he just put everything in such simple terms. And, it's like we humans make everything so complicated. Really, it's very, very simple. You're just afraid because you don't trust God. You just think you're so important that everything you think matters so much, but really it doesn't because you're not that important. You just go to God with it. He'll figure it all out, and that kind of thing. He's just so like that. And it saved my life really so many times. And he was like that with everyone. And I know that it kept, as far as how he handled the group, he kept that thing going. The group kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I know that he preferred that it be smaller just simply because you could keep it more intimate and people didn't get overlooked, when you had newcomers come in and that kind of thing. But it still kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And when he was there, which I came in at the last, I got sober in 2003, but I was active in a different fellowship for a couple of years before I came back, and then he was my sponsor. So I guess I really didn't come back and get active in PPG until about 2005. He probably was only there for a good maybe 5 years, and then he had to stay home because he couldn't afford to get sick from all the people coming in there because of, his health and everything. Anyway, but while he was there still going to the group, he would go up to people he didn't recognize, every single person he didn't recognize before the group or after the group, and he would introduce himself and make them feel welcome. And he would say to people, has anyone told you they love you today? And he'd say, well, I do. And, of course, I don't know how it affected everyone else, but many people it affected by making them feel good, you know. Or at least it did me, and I know it did a lot of other people. Maybe with guys it might have made them feel weird, I don't know, but I know for a lot of women it would have made them feel good. Because he was old enough that it didn't make him feel weird, like, oh, this young guy is coming up to me and telling me that stuff. He was old enough that they felt like this grandfatherly guy is telling them he loves them, and that's a good feeling. But that's one of the things about Cliff is, he would say that to people that he didn't know, and it's a wonderful thing. I try to remember to do that, and I keep forgetting, but sometimes I'll do that with people at work, and it really throws them. And, of course, I have to be careful who I do that with at work, or it can get really weird. So try to do that just with people that I'm kind of close with at work, so I don't get, to thinking I'm just too weird. But and it does always make their day. But that's one of those things that's really special about him is he would always try to just make people feel good, make people feel happy and not ashamed and feel good, that sort of thing. Not saying he couldn't come down on me pretty hard when it was necessary, but for all the things that people would say about what a hard ass he was a very loving sponsor, very, very loving. He was almost never harsh with me. Now, he would tell me, he would say, you screwed up. Well, he'd say, you effed up, but, but he wouldn't say it in a hateful or mean way, If I was getting whiny about it, about the consequences or whatever, he'd say, well, you fucked up. What do you expect? That kind of thing. But he would tell me, well, this is what you signed on for. This is the way it's going to be. He'd just tell me straight and just tell me how it was and keep life very simple. He saved my life. He's probably been I don't know. I need to get back to, I guess, my story. But as far as my life goes, as a result of him being in it, over the years, he sponsored me for my Al-Anon stuff too, because he's a recovered Al-Anon. When I had trouble crop up from my compulsive eating, I had gotten a little spiritually unfit due to some resentment at work. This was a number of years ago, and my compulsive eating came back. It just came back all in a rush. It was so bizarre to me because that had been completely taken away when I recovered from my alcoholism. And I hadn't had problems with it except at the beginning of my recovery from alcoholism. But then it had cleared up and not been a problem. And then all of a sudden it just came back. And when I prayed about it and God revealed to me what the cause of it was, and I realized it was this ongoing resentment about stuff at work that I had been 10-stepping about, but hadn't, some misunderstanding had cropped up, and we hadn't cleared it up, Cliff and I, and stuff. So we did a fourth and fifth step on it. Cliff and I did. Basically, Cliff took me through the work to clear up that compulsive eating problem that had cropped back up, and it took care of it. But after that, he had me start working with people for that problem as well. before that, I hadn't really done that because it just hadn't really been the focus, even though I had, recovered from that problem as well. Anyway, the point to this is what he taught me during that time was I could help people with that problem as well, but I didn't have to have a separate sponsor for that. And so what I've learned is a person who is a solidly recovered AA doesn't have to go off and get a compulsive eating sponsor to recover from compulsive eating. They just need, if they've got a compulsive eating problem, they may just need to go get some information about compulsive eating. Or say they've got some other problem crop up. They need to go get some information about that step one so they can learn about what's going on with them. They can really understand that and go through the work with their current sponsor to recover from that. And then they may need to get some information about how to carry the message for that problem. But they don't necessarily have to go, so they can carry the message to somebody who's still suffering about step one, so they can help them understand step one and that kind of thing. But that they don't have to necessarily get involved in another fellowship, and they don't have to necessarily go get a separate sponsor for all that, because it can become very confusing to a person if you've got a separate sponsor and a separate fellowship for every single problem that you have, because a lot of us have a lot of different problems, and because I've got the three issues, and if I'd had a different sponsor and a different fellowship for all three of them, he said I would have started to go crazy. And that's what he taught me, and he's been correct as far as I didn't need a separate sponsor and a separate fellowship for all of that stuff, and I still was able to help people. But anyway, I just wanted to point that out. But it's been remarkable. Also, one of the other things that he's been remarkable about is being able to, because many of us do have problems in other areas, a lot of us have been able to help people in other, a lot of, there's people like, for example, in our group who have gone off and started other fellowships, like the DAA. Well, they didn't start that fellowship, but they started a group over here in the United States from the DAA fellowship, and that's really taken off here because they were drug addicts, and they wanted to be able to talk about their drug addict problem, but they were also alcoholics, and so they had started off in AA, but they wanted to go over and get involved in another fellowship, and so they're able to help those alcoholics and drug addicts and all that kind of thing, and it's pretty remarkable. And there's people from Heroin Anonymous and everything else. But Cliff is really remarkable, but he has saved my life because he helped all those people before I ever came along, and because he stuck with it in spite of all of the negativity that was thrown at him. And I remember learning about, when he first got started doing, starting a group and everything, there were a number of people that started with him, and I think only a few stuck it out. And at the very end, there was just him. So I'm so grateful for him. But him and the others that stuck with it long enough to get it going and teach that the big book has the solution and that it can help all of us. And thank God for that, because it really made such a difference. And all the people in the world, all the people in the world that he's helped. And I've got so many friends that I wouldn't have if not for him, and a whole life that I wouldn't have if not for him. And I feel like he's probably the most, if not the most important person in my life. Certainly one of the most important. He ranks right up there with my parents, you know, and I'm so grateful for that. I think that's it for my story now, Dana. That's all I've got to say.